Today we continue to hear God's word as found in the Old Testament, a story that is just as much a part of our story as the New Testament is. Today we find ourselves with Elijah, a prophet of Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. And immediately before this, I don't know how many of you remember the story where they were having a battle. What God was going to light the fire of the sacrifice? Was it going to be the prophets of Baal, and Baal would bring down his power and light the sacrifice? Or was it going to be the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, who was going to bring down the fire and start that sacrifice? So what God was going to win? Well, Yahweh won, thanks be to God. But then everybody got really mad at Elijah and all of the other prophets, and so they killed them all, except for Elijah. And so he goes running into the wilderness, and this is where we find him today. So hear God's word for us from 1 Kings chapter 19. Ahab, the current king at the time, told Jezebel, his wife, the queen, all that Elijah had done, and how Ahab had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah was afraid, and he got up and he fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you." So he got up and he ate and he drank, and then he went in the strength of the Lord, of that food, 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. And at that place, the mountain, he came to a cave and spent the night there. And then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And he said, God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after a wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You shall also appoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall appoint Elisha, son of Japhat Abel Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. And I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. My friends, it has been another crazy week. Just a week ago, a mass shooting in a church, no less. More threats of nuclear war or of war in general. More and more allegations and voices seeking justice for sexual violence against women. And I bet that not many of us had much of a response, except to hang our heads, shake them perhaps, and feel helpless to do anything else. Personally, I didn't even want to dig into any of it, the history of the perpetrator at the church in Sutherland, Texas, because quite frankly, I'm sick of our inability to have any kind of civil public discord over the use or regulation of guns. Some on my news feed, as usual, blame the NRA and its lobbying efforts, and then on the other side, the NRA equally demonstrated its communication of not needing to regulate anything. More women who have stayed in the silent shadows of shame and pain for a long time are now coming forward in droves, using their voices in a public climate where there is power in numbers. And then there are those, of course, who have said, why did they wait so long? Violence, misconduct, and corruption have become so much a part of our lives that we have become numb to it. Perhaps we've become like those in the story of the Good Samaritan who walk on by the beaten man on the road, because to look at him means we'd have to ask ourselves some questions about why he was there, who hurt him, and what does it mean to follow Jesus in a world where people end up abused, beaten, and left for dead. But many of us, I'm sure our shock and dismay, frustration and anger has led us to simply go into the wilderness, either to hide from the complexity and intensity, or for others, deep sadness, kind of like Elijah in our story. Today, many of us, if you're anything like me, find ourselves sitting with Elijah, having a pity party. Well, I am, at least. I really want to just hide out on Rosendale Road and keep to myself, talking with my neighbor who displays his rebel or Confederate flag, however you want to describe it, for 365 days, which confuses and quite frankly offends me. To talk with him about racial privilege is not on my list of responsibilities to be up real soon. And remaining silent is not typically my mode for any of you, those of you who know me. But that's just where I am right now. And in his despair, God finds Elijah and offers him food, invites him on an even more intense journey for 40 days and 40 nights deeper into the wilderness to Mount Horeb, that special place where the 10 Commandments were given to God's people. And as a little aside here, not to even get any more snarky, sometimes I'm totally into this God thing, right? Because God always shows up. Always. But then you have these stories where God is kind of like, well, I'm not just going to give you some food and drink and make everything better, be your fiery godmother. Well, rather, I'm going to give you food and then have you walk for 40 more days. And I was just hungry and wanted to mope a little. But upon arriving at Mount Horeb after 40 days, God makes God's self known again to Elijah. Depression and utter despair can do that to you. It makes God show up to remind you that all is not lost. Hope is still around, and it may not be in the ways that you've ever known. The message to Elijah was pretty darn direct. Go to Judah appoint new kings, and hand over the reins to the next prophets and leaders. And there's still over 7,000 people who serve me. My message of power and love is still true. In moments of frustration, Elijah illustrates for us that it is okay to feel depleted because reality is real. And sometimes we've done all we can. And instead of going into the wilderness and leaving ourselves for dead, God shows up and says, now is not the time, and gives us concrete direction for how to move forward. And it may not always be in the sound of sheer silence, after all that glamour of nature's chorus. But God will show up. And you know what I'm talking about, right? That word from a friend, a line in a sermon, or even a character on your favorite TV show that brings you to tears. Yes, I'm convinced that God does use modern technology. I wanted to say that it was about trust. Try harder and trust God. Yes and no. Because sometimes my pity party is really large. I'm adamantly not going to trust God. Yet it's funny how things work. God will speak fairly clearly, even if we don't want to hear our call to work in the world. So Elijah and God's story today remind us to, throw out the pity party and get back to work. Because as people of faith, our work with God doesn't end. It's a lifelong thing. No one is too old, too tired, too young, doesn't know enough, or knows too much. Most of us are pretty bad at listening. So when our story takes this turn for Elijah to find God on Mount Horeb, I'm truly ready for that loud, right? I am here, dear mortal, and I will make all things well. No. God is in the absence. God is in the silence. A wise disciple and follower of Jesus Christ, author, poet Friedrich Buechner once wrote, "It is in the absence of God that we find God's greatest presence." There's so much visual and auditory noise in our lives that silence is so palpable. It's so shrilling that we turn on the radio so we don't have to be in it. When we're sitting on the side of the mountain deep in the wilderness, God will still speak to us and let us know what our role in this world is. It's not just that you'll know God. But like our leader Jesus will tell the disciples in about 500 years or so after this story, you must also follow. I'm convinced over and over again that the world needs our voice of hope and love more than ever, rather than our running into the wilderness or perhaps even into our houses of worship to avoid it. Our God yearns for us to live and embody it for the world. We eat what God puts before us because it's what we have. It's what sustains us. God is all that really offers us any true hope in times of confusion and uncertainty. The hard part is that after we have been fed, just like Elijah, sense and experience that true presence of God, the pity party needs to be over. And we recognize that we are continually called back into the world to bring God's message. So won't you join me this week and in the weeks ahead as we begin to journey into Advent and Christmas, as we walk with the prophets and the young Jesus to recognize what it is that is frustrating about our world and sit together as community, as family, to be fed by God and the God we know when we are together. And then let us respond as grateful as just and as generous stewards to what we hear God inviting us to hear. We have got leaders to pick. We've got new leaders to train and hand over the reins to. Things are hard. And God shows up. And God leads us back into that world, offering healing and hope and a powerful vision of love. That's the good news this day. Thanks be to God for God's presence, for God's power, and for God's love, despite the chaos of our world. And God's people say,